The floor is yours.
Goedemiddag, ek is Willemien Froneman. I'll be speaking in English, but I'll start off in Afrikaans if you don't mind. So ek is verbonde aan die Universiteit van Stellenbosch. Ek is hier danksy Magriet van der Walt wat so vriendelik was om hierdie te reël en Tara en Wessels. Baie dankie vir al julle moeite en dankie vir almal wat hier is. Ek is hier vandag om te gesels oor my boek wat in 2024 gepubliseer is, The Groovology of White Affect. Nie die mooiste voorblad nie, maar mens moet maar 'n bietjie binne-in rondlaai. En baie dankie dat julle hier is, dat ek my idees met julle kan deel, maar ek gaan wel in Engels praat, so ek gaan nou maar oorskakel daarheen. So I'll start just with a couple of general questions that I think people have been struggling with when thinking or researching music for as long as people have done that, really. How is it that our bodies respond to a groove in a certain way or not at all? What does it mean when we say we love certain kinds of music and we hate others? Is there a social basis for our musical pet hates, commitments, identifications, and desires? What people often refer to as the power of music is one of those great mysteries of social life. Does music not make us wonder at our individual and collective capacity to be touched and prompted into movement by something outside of us? These questions are not only about what music might mean, but about how these meanings might matter to people and how they become enregistered into feeling something. So I thought I'd start my talk today by asking you to reflect on some of these questions while watching the first couple of minutes of an episode of a Boeremusiek competition aired on South African television in 1986. Some of you would be familiar with this. And I want you to think not only about your own responses to this performance, how you are being touched by it, but also about how this white South African audience may have been moved by this music in 1986. So it's a bit pixelated, but we'll give it our best shot.
Hier is in Atelier 5 en hier woon nog 'n program van ons Boereorkes kompetisie by. U gasheer, Gerard Beweer.
Goeienaand en hartelijk welkom vanuit Atelier 5, waar 'n mens vanaand die atmosfeer so met 'n mes kan sny. Ja, Zuid-Afrika se 4 beste boereorkeste is gekies. En nou kom 2 van hulle vanaand in die eerste half-eindstryd van die 1986 Boereorkes kompetisie te mekaar te staan. Kom ek stel hulle voor. Hier uit Pretoria, ou bekendes onder leiding van Hasie Rood, die Suid-Afrikaanse Polisie Dansorkes. En ek wil sê, dit is die tweede keer dat hulle aan 'n half-eindstryd deelneem. En dan wil jy glo, vir die eerste keer sedert hierdie kompetisie in 1980 begin het, is dit 'n Kaapse orkes wat in 'n half-eindstryd gewikkel is. En daarom van harte geluk en welkom aan embodied en sy orkes. En embodied sê vir my, die vis bly voor die wind daar in die Kaap. Ek wag nog vir myne. Maar nou ja, laat ons voortgaan met die musiek. En om hierdie stryd van die concertina konings aan te knoop, is dit die Suid-Afrikaanse Polisie Dansorkes wat hierdie stryd loods met Mannie Bodenstein en 'n nommertjie van Fanny Bos, Oom Piet se polka. En daarna vervolg die orkes van Oom Boetie Kallis met die Knorrhaan Vastrap.
So perhaps you share with me a certain queasiness that is difficult to put into words. Maybe you felt mm, that you got into the groove. Maybe this performance left you cold, or maybe it elicited some other kind of response. What could a performance like this one possibly signify? And how could this matter to us now, looking at it from the perspective of the present? The first thing one could say, and they one would echo the sentiment of nearly all my musicological predecessors in South Africa, is that this performance doesn't mean very much at all. That it portrays but a banal, unimportant, and for some embarrassing moment from our shared musical past doesn't really merit our attention. There are, of course, more sophisticated ways of saying this. One could situate it in a scholarly polarity between a high and a low culture, where this performance is decidedly an example of the latter, or one could relegate such a performance to a sphere of entertainment outside of real significance. But if one decides in principle to take performances such as these seriously, as I've done in my book, The Groovology of White Affect, there are a myriad of other options to explore. For one could attempt to assemble historical contexts of expanding circumference around this performance. Who are these people? What were they about? Where does the performance fit into the South African broadcasting apparatus of the 1980s? Who is the community addressed by this performance? Is it a subcultural community of Boeremusiek aficionados only? Or is it the television audience, i.e., the general white Afrikaner public who tuned in to watch the show? One might read it, the performance, as a microcosm of relationships between different kinds of parts to wholes in white Afrikaner society of the time. One could, in other words, view the performance as a public ritual of some importance, a public ritual that symbolizes and expresses the shared values of a community in some way. How does it read? In other words, one may ask, against the fact that South Africa was at that time in an apartheid state of emergency. Closer to attributing meaning to this performance. But in order to say something about how these meanings might have mattered to its listeners, how it might have impacted them or moved them, one would have to take a more radical stance, I think, especially because these white bodies in that first video are not presenting us with very much to go on, and are, for the most part, disavowing the fact that Boeremusiek is dance music. In this case, it becomes all the more important not to view the musical performance only as an epiphenomenon of something else, but as a primary mode of social sense making. And this is a project I think I'm trying to accomplish in this book, is to take music and Buddha music in this case, but also in general, as a way of theorizing about society and about the relationships within society. So not merely seeing it as a reflection of what is happening currently, but as a way in which people actually model how society should be and how they should look. In such a conception, the musical performance is a foundational context, a primary modeling system of collective life. It means that the musical performance doesn't always follow or reinforce the logics of other social arenas like political ideology or class distinctions, but does in fact often contradict them, stand in tension with them, operating in its own autonomous terms. This entails the recognition, especially in light of South Africa's apartheid and colonial past, that this musical modeling system is an unruly thing. It can measure itself with authoritarian thought as much as with ideals of freedom, and therefore requires our sustained critical attention. Just as an example of this unruliness, consider the extraordinary fact that Ahmed Kathrada, the anti-apartheid activist who was sentenced to prison with Nelson Mandela during the Rivonia trials of the 1960s, writes to Ellen Josephs from his cell in Pollsmoor prison after watching one of these very episodes of the Boeremusiek competition in 1986. He writes to her, "You may be surprised to learn that I enjoyed the couple of sessions of Boeremusiek, most probably because it takes me far back to my childhood days on the platteland. For all our Gujarat origins and the emphasis on Arabic in the Quran, Kathrada explains his affinity for Boeremusiek elsewhere. We grew up speaking more Afrikaans than anything else. The women in my family still speak Afrikaans, and Boeremusiek, traditional folk music played on a concertina, still makes me nostalgic. It is hard to imagine this response to the band of the South African police force, the one we witnessed there at the beginning, who violently, representative of a system, who violently imprisoned Kathrada. And yet, Kathrada does not speak of these signs that point not only towards an exclusively white experience of leisure, but to the white human infrastructure of late apartheid. The performance we see there are police officers, farmers, blue-collared workers. This despite the fact that Kathrada, classified as Indian by the apartheid government, was systematically and violently excluded from the everyday life referenced in that performance. So this idea of music as a primary modeling system closely relates to what we might refer to as music's so-called ineffability, its effervescence, or the significant surplus of feeling music making and dance generate in performance. The life thus brought into being, wrote Emil Durkheim on this effervescence, enjoys so great an independence that it sometimes indulges in manifestations with no purpose of utility of any sort, for the mere pleasure of affirming itself. And we can see something of that when we watch that first performance. As Clayton notes, however, the autonomy of aesthetic experience does not preclude music's social function. And in fact, and this is, I guess, one of the main arguments of my book, the effect of music may indeed be more profound precisely because its meanings are not brought to the surface and articulated, but is presented as a kind of magic. So it is with this idea that I launch into my talk today, that those heightened states of arousal afforded by music and dance, what I discuss in my book under the term affect, are ways of imagining or modeling social life, and that their impact is profoundly potent precisely because those feeling states generated by music are often not brought to the surface and articulated into words. I come to the problem of what one could call music's magic then from the perspective of critical whiteness studies and with an interest in how racism perpetuates itself. The problem of the opacity of musical performances and how we might get these bodies to reveal something of themselves speak, to my mind, to the problem of white racism more broadly, that it operates within a conception of the body that is taken as the norm and within its own seeming self-evidence and banality. Conversations at institutions the world over are currently reflecting on the tenacity of racial thinking, the way racist and race-based ideas find strongholds in our midst, and how race-based thinking reaches its tentacles into our organizational patterns and scientific inquiry. My book contends that the reception history of Boeremusiek can help us understand how racism operates in the world, by bringing to the surface some of the hidden structures of feeling or the heightened states of arousal that mark a commitment to whiteness. In this regard, my project can be seen as a kind of social psychoanalysis. Its goal is to bring the social unconscious up for view, to reveal some of the myths that govern our thinking and feeling, so that we may come up with alternative modes of being in the world. So let's return for the moment to those two videos I've shown you, both representing a take on what was going on in South Africa in 1986. And I was wondering if I could hear some of your thoughts, perhaps. How can we think of these respective musical takes on the political reality in South Africa at the time, if you were to compare them, their relationship to a political reality or a social reality? Yeah.
That is very organized with a televised contest, so there's budget available to experience that music. Where the second video was people in the streets, people in churches, just people coming together and just in a moment coming up.
Perhaps more spontaneous then. And you could have a sense of a sort of a power differential just in the production modes. What else? Yeah.
I'm struck by what seems to be, to my mind, a need for reassurance that the music represents in all three cases of the three different kinds of music we hear, whether it's the soldiers marching, whether it's the activists protesting, and certainly with the bands competing, that there's a kind of feeling, or maybe I only just think this because of the historical context, that it's, you clamp onto that music that makes you feel reassured in a time of crisis and emergency.
Yeah, and that's no less true for the first example of Boeremusiek than for the others. But are we sort of accustomed to think that way?
I don't know.
Because in the second example, I think one could sense perhaps a closer relationship to a social reality of apartheid. I mean, if you were to say these two examples are taken from apartheid South Africa. I mean, you obviously you can see something of that in the first performance because it's only white people performing to a white audience, right? But if you were to gauge the engagement with what is actually going on around that musical performance, I don't know, don't you sense a certain distancing from that? Or do you disagree with me? Yeah?
Well, Groovology, it kind of felt taken out of context. As you've already pointed out, it is meant to be danced to. And it's just a performance and people sitting and watching. Where the second video, well, I'm not able to distinguish, I don't know their original context, but it seemed to me they were being performed in a context that seemed logical. It seemed to be songs meant to be performed in larger groups relevant to those moments. So the Boeremusiek is more, it seemed taken out of context. It's not at a party at a farm.
Yes, but I think what I'm trying to argue also is that is also the context. That taking out of the context is the context of how whiteness has been performed in apartheid South Africa. But what interests me about that example as well is it's if you think of it as a performance of whiteness, which it I guess would obviously be if it is in a white audience by the South African police force in 1986. What do you have any idea what that banjo could indicate in the second example, musically and socially? Is that a sort of a typical signifier of whiteness? Well, in South African music, has any one of you encountered that banjo sound before elsewhere in South African music? Yeah, exactly. So doesn't it strike you as odd that you have this performance of whiteness during apartheid South Africa with an overt reference to coloredness and to a different racial category, because this was in the context of this is where there's a strict racial categorization going on. So what strikes me about this example is not the categories, but how they are crossed in music quite often. And in Boeremusiek, you find this quite a lot. You find it in the nomenclature. The term Boeremusiek was synonymous with a derogatory term, Hotnotsmusiek, for instance, Hottentots music, until the late 1950s. So there's a sort of a way that the hybrid racial history of the music is acknowledged and then disavowed. And that's the kind of the point that I want to come to, this idea of disavowal. I'll just see if I can move on to my next slide. And disavowal is, if you take the psychoanalytic meaning of the term, Verleugnung, it's one of the three primary diagnostic categories according to Lacan. So you have three ways of negating reality. The one is to suppress it, the one is to disavow it, and then there's also foreclosure. So disavowal is slightly different from repression. Repression is where the thing that is being repressed, in this case, perhaps the music's racial hybridity, is not performed at all. So there's no inkling that you're dealing here with hybridity or cross-racial music making. But in Boeremusiek, you see, I think, something else. you see this disavowal in practice. In other words, there are many signifiers that point to a different racial category within the music, but it is denied by the name Boeremusiek, for instance, which is a genitive. It means the music of the Boere, but also in a word like apartheid. Even that word itself, if anyone who grew up during apartheid could attest, wasn't actually true in many ways. It wasn't part of a domestic reality, for instance. People did not grow up apart. They grew up with a different kind of mechanism, which is perhaps better illustrated by a sketch like this one, where you would have the party going on in what is here presented as a voorkamer, the front room of a Cape Dutch homestead. You could see the picture up on the wall that suggests tradition or a previous generation, but then at the periphery of that sketch, you have two black figures ostensibly enjoying the music. But it's clear that this is sort of a socially stratified context, right? They are enjoying the party, but they are servants. They are not part of the party. And I think in lots of Boeremusiek reception history, you have this idea that there's a cross-racial music making going on. But what I'm suggesting in my book is that the music kind of teaches the apartheid era or the white apartheid era how to negate certain parts of that history, to listen, in other words, very selectively. And I always think of this by the way I grew up, perhaps, in very close contact to people speaking other languages, but being unable to actually understand that language. So there must be some kind of mechanism in which white children growing up during apartheid discriminated sonically between meaningful sound and non-meaningful sound. And I see in Boeremusiek's history a way of understanding that aspect of apartheid through this idea of disavowal, that one learns to hear things in a certain way, to attribute meaning to it, and then to discard other parts of the sonic world as being not that important or not meaningful. And you often find that in descriptions of composers of art music also, who goes abroad after having lived in South Africa a long time. So then they start getting nostalgic for home, and they say they miss the sounds of South Africa, and they would say they miss the thunderstorms, they miss the rain on the sink roofs, and then they miss the sound of the Zulu exclamations around them, as if they all form part of a kind of a backdrop. So they don't miss the meaning of people speaking Zulu because they don't understand it, but they miss the sound of Zuluness. That's sort of part of nature and part of a backdrop against which a whiteness sort of plays itself off. So coming from this idea of disavowal, just sort of moving on to what I think is sort of the most important points I'm trying to make in my book. Let's move on now. So in the book, I discuss what I call four modalities of affect. So if we think of affect as those feeling states we touched upon earlier, disavowal being one of them. But the others in the book that I discuss are embarrassment. So there's a whole body of reception history on Boeremusiek where people speak about their own embarrassment about the music. And it's not always a negative term, it's how they appreciate the music. So, for instance, someone would say, when they want to compliment a concertina player, they would say, now there's a man who wasn't embarrassed about the music. Or people will try to use embarrassment as a way of distancing themselves from the music, as I have often also done myself. But in that is also a kind of an affect of Boeremusiek, I argue in the end, that it's a way of appreciating the music while distancing oneself from it. So what you get in Boeremusiek reception is a really complicated idea of the affects as being quite ambivalent. So you get disavowal, embarrassment. These feelings are not obvious. They are not either positive or negative. They're sort of in between. Blackface is the other one, which is perhaps more easy to understand just because it's a physical mask that is put on when the music is performed and then allows the white body to do other things that it doesn't normally, that's it not normally able to do. So there's a kind of a, when donning a blackface mask, the white performers are encouraged to be more outspoken, to move around more wildly, things like that. So you get a lot of that in the reception history. And then also the epiphany is one of the other modalities I discuss. Another way of sort of managing this conflicted emotions that are brought to the surface. So I have an example of that, which I will first go to, and then we can come back to this since I've just thought of this. So here's I'll read this in a little bit. This is a quote, a part of a diary entry by Jo Fourie. She was a Dutch-born woman. She was born in Zwolle and came to South Africa, I think, in 1902 or 3. She married Hasia M. Fourie, was one of the Bible translators. And then when he died, she went around the country and she made transcriptions of Boeremusiek tunes. So just to give you an idea of how these modalities of affect work, let's read through this. So she writes, from Babanango, I also visited Amsterdam. This is not this Amsterdam, but the one in what was then the Natal province, where Mr. and Mrs. Spies gave me valuable information, but only one tune. That was because Mrs. Spies, out of religious conscientiousness, only agreed to the marriage if Mr. Spies promised to give up the concertina. He did so, and when I visited them in 1948, he had never broken his promise. However, after I had explained to them the value of folk music, and therefore also of our own Boeremusiek, they started thinking and feeling differently about the matter. My concertina lay on the table. Mr. Spies takes it lovingly into his hands, turns it around and around, and not having touched an instrument for 52 years, plays an old little mazurka, true to style, almost without missing a beat. It was touching to behold. So this is sort of an example of the what I call the modality of the epiphany, where all the difficulties with the music is sort of in a moment of sudden enlightenment is done away with. So you can, if we read for affect in this part, I will come back to this a little bit later, and then we can again look at how this meta language of affect works. So perhaps now I just like to read you, going back to these key ideas. I thought I'd read you a couple of pages where I discuss what I mean by whiteness as an affective disorder. So in order for us to get there, we need to assume a few things about race. The one is that race is not only done in language, right? It's not only discursive, it is also an affective construct. In other words, it's also about how people feel and about taste and about pleasure. Okay, so I'll just read this. The book argues that race thinking in South Africa has lodged itself not only in the material objects, discourses, and practices of white expressive culture, but in the dimensions of the white aesthetic faculty itself. Racism in this definition is not merely a question of prejudice, it's a matter of pleasure and a matter of taste. This was hinted at by the late Richard Turner in one of his meditations on the deficits of white consciousness. The average white South African is scarcely one of the higher forms of life, Turner mused in the uncompromising prose that probably led to his assassination in 1979. For Turner, white consciousness was cabbage consciousness, an incapacity to experience the freedom of what it meant to be fully human. Material privilege, he went on, is bought at the cost of mental atrophy, and for whites who have recognized this, the desire to change South Africa manifested as an urgent need for personal dignity and the air of freedom and love. The other precedent for considering white race thinking as a collectively incubated yet individually felt affective disorder is James Coetzee's influential article on apartheid thinker Geoffrey Cronje, published 30 years ago. The historical scholarship devoted to apartheid seems to me to suffer from self-imposed limitations, wrote Coetzee in The Mind of Apartheid. Coetzee contended that apartheid and the racial segregationism that preceded it was a form of madness that set for itself the task of reforming, by which we should understand deforming, the human heart, and that it is ultimately in the layer of the heart that apartheid must be approached. For this reason, Coetzee argued that apartheid could be known empirically from the outside only to a limited extent, and that getting at the obsessional neurosis of race thinking required strategies that exceeded the historical method proper. If we wish to understand apartheid, Coetzee concluded, we cannot ignore its testament as it comes down to us in the hard speech of autobiography or confession. We need to follow its ravings and inhabit it with a part of ourselves. So in this book, I approach Boeremusiek practice and reception as a similar kind of confessional hard speech. In one sense, I take Coetzee's metaphor quite literally. I locate statements of belief about taste, affective experience, and pleasure in Boeremusiek's historical record, archival deposits, sonic and material culture, expressive tropes, and contemporary practices. What qualifies as statements of belief about these elusive concepts is, of course, a difficult matter. For one, ideas about musical taste or enjoyment are often not primarily expressed in language. Sometimes they are not ideas at all, but embodied and performed through movement, posture, and gesture. And even when the medium is linguistic, reflections on taste, affect, and pleasure rarely announce themselves in explicit terms. More often than not, they are hidden away in the performative and pragmatic aspects of language use. To get at Boeremusiek's hard speech, therefore, requires a good dose of critical theory and a Goffmanesque meta-pragmatic awareness of the code or the frames that structure affective life. What complicates the matter further is that Boeremusiek's pleasure principles more often than not derive from doublespeak, ambivalence, and erasure. What characterizes Boeremusiek's hard speech more than anything else is how it creates and sustains, as a dimension of pleasure itself, uncertainty around whether the music is or should be enjoyable to white people at all. Pleasure often sits at the threshold of enjoyment, horror, and damnation, and the music's affect registers as indictment, embarrassment, guilt, disavowal, or fear. Arguably, however, it is precisely the provisionality of white affect that renders it legible in language and performance. When listeners and practitioners engage with Boeremusiek with reserved commitment or signal through some symbolic or pragmatic means their concerns about the appropriateness of their affective responses, they are creating a meta-language of affect. In other words, a language about the language of affect, a meta-language that presupposes and entails, as I will show, a theory of race. I think one can see this in that example we read earlier, right? So if one thinks of this quote as a reflection on whether being moved by Boeremusiek is appropriate or not, this description clearly shows a man, describes a man who thought it was not appropriate, right? Because otherwise he would have played. So even in this description, although it is not precisely pointing to that, one can read that into this, right? So immediately you have a sense that the music is prohibited in some way, and it's not quite clear from this context why. But one gets the information that it is somehow to do with religion. So there's a religious prohibition against dancing that is here expressed as a prohibition against playing the concertina. So in lots of the descriptions of concertina playing and Boeremusiek, the instrument would be described as the devil's instrument. It would be played behind a curtain sometimes. It would be played far out in the fields. It would be played in secret. And all of these things help us to understand how, I think, how whiteness operates as having these two sets of rules. The one that is official and shown forward in public, and the other one in which exists in these sort of as-if spaces, where the music is performed under certain conditions or not at all, or in this case by this man for 52 years, only in his imagination. And I think there's a lot to say about that. So just as another illustration of what I call this meta language of affect. It's also very intriguing to look into the Afrikaans etymology of words relating to Boeremusiek. One of my favorites is this alternative name for Boeremusiek, which is pisvoet, which has the word has three meanings. So you have the veterinary meaning. First, let's begin with the botanical meaning, which refers to a shrub that only grows in a certain part of South Africa. Then you have the veterinary meaning, which is the illness that oxen develop when eating the shrub, which which gives them a urethritis, which means they can't move. They move around wildly. They can't stop moving. And if you can imagine that as a quite negative description of dancing, it sort of takes hold of the body. You cannot stop once you've started it. And it's also sort of referred to as a kind of an illness. So the music becomes a kind of pathological in a way. Once it gets hold of you, you are done with in a way. So you have to keep on dancing until you die. Then the third meaning, where it's also a reference to dancing, where it refers to boils on the soles of the feet. And then finally you get this specific meaning where it refers to the music itself. So by looking at the language around affect, how people have expressed their taste or preference, or more often than not really, how they have been moved by the music in a way that they didn't really want to be moved, you can extract quite a lot of information about what this music means. It's just that in general music discourse, people have tended to only look at positive responses to music. So you would often negate it when people say they dislike the music or they have an ambivalent response. Usually people do research within communities where everyone likes the particular music they are concerned with. But if you draw the net a little bit wider, the audience then becomes not only Boeremusiek aficionados, but really anyone listening to Boeremusiek and anyone getting any kind of response to it, which is often formulaic in a certain way. And this is what I kind of argue, that in language and in gesture, going back to this previous point of the mimetic archive, that in the language and gestures and performance and the repertoire of the music, all the stories that has been told about it, it becomes an archive of things that contemporary practitioners draw on, but it's also an archive of listening. So that the response that people often think are only their own, for example, being embarrassed or feeling guilty or being moved by it, are often intergenerationally transferred through music and performance and language. And this is what I draw out in my book. So just to finish off, I think I will just discuss a few more broader points that I think are important. I don't want to posit them as axioms, but I think it's kind of the contribution that the book makes to broader ideas. Boeremusiek's relationship with whiteness operates within a meta-language of affect, as we have seen. I've shown you a few examples, but there are many more, ideologically saturated with racial concerns. In this way, it mirrors how European folk and popular traditions have historically encoded embodied and affective racial identities and boundaries within seemingly benign cultural expressions. Then, perhaps more something that we could discuss. Maybe everyone will not agree with me, but from my work on Boeremusiek, I suggest that musical affect is fundamentally racialized, underscoring that music, race, and affect operate as mutual technologies in shaping embodied racial identities. Boeremusiek's modalities of affect illustrate how affect functions as a device that allows listeners to navigate discomfort and confusion in order to reaffirm an imaginary, uncontaminated, racialized self-perception. Boeremusiek's pleasures exist in subjunctive spaces of unfulfilled potential, in as-if spaces, enacting a continual salvaging of whiteness within a racially defined imaginary. European traditions that revisit a mythologized past or uphold unexamined national pride likewise occupies those subjunctive spaces, sustaining identity as an affect of an ongoing act of racial salvage. Then race thinking is not merely, or perhaps not even primarily, cognitive. In South Africa and Europe alike, it is ingrained in an aesthetic faculty as a matter of taste and pleasure, rendering racism an endearing affective state that is difficult to dislodge. Contemporary musical practice across these contexts become arenas for whiteness to subtly and repeatedly negotiate its self-concepts, shaping racial identity as an unconscious yet embodied preference within cultural traditions. And then finally, the racialized modalities of affect one can witness in Boeremusiek discourse and practice reveals more about whiteness in general than about individual cultural practices or a particular group of practitioners. In tune with the idea with which I started my talk that music is a primary modeling system of social life, my book points to this broader role of music and sound in understanding social life and the dynamics between people. Thank you. That's my question. I don't know if there's any questions, discussion. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll start with a very obvious or simple question.
Just 1 second, 1 second. Then online they can listen as well.
Okay. Thank you very much for fascinating talk. And I wish you would, yeah, I want to hear more. Um, both of the music and of your discussion of it. One maybe obvious question. Can you say that the Boer music was codified in this particular historical period? Does it represent the past in some way?
I think, like all folk traditions, it deals with the past as a modernist thing. So in many of these traditions, you get some kind of moment. Usually in Europe, it happens a bit earlier than in South Africa, where the point of the music becomes its salvage to keep it safe and to protect it for future generations. So in that sense, it is, and that of course is closely connected to nationalism in South Africa and in Europe as well. But so in that sense, it is occupied with the past, but it is not the real. It's not the real past. It is. It is the old time, the old time of Boeremusiek, which is imagined as this place where people get together on farms where they dance to the music, but which I think for the last, I don't know, 100 years probably did not happen as much, and is lives more in the recollection of that idea than in the thing itself. So I think it is definitely to do with the past, but it's always also to reestablish something in the present. Yeah, and the modernist moment in Boeremusiek is very interesting because you have this Dutch woman who kind of pushes the agenda, and then there's a radio program in the 1950s that's aired, I think, throughout the whole year, with weekly episodes of reenactments of some of the transcriptions that she recorded. Now, just to remember that Hugh Tracy was the South African ethnomusicologist of black music, but by that time he was already recording with recording equipment, so there wasn't really a need to do it by hand anymore. But she was like she wasn't really trained in that way, so she just did what she could in this community she worked with. So we have these very basic kind of transcriptions. It's only a single melodic line, sometimes with some harmonic indications, and then the bands of Hendrik Susan or Hansie van Logrenberg would reenact these performances on radio. And then it's very funny if you read those transcriptions of the radio program, because in a way it seems that the way they performed was indistinguishable from the way they performed anyway. So they would play the tune as transcribed, and then the radio presenter would say, well, the bass line really, that's not how it should be done. It's too jazz infused. It has to be clearer. Or they will say, well, the way the guitarist used the plectrum, that's really not how the Boere used to play. So in effect, you get a creation of a tradition, but it isn't even recreated in sound. It sounds pretty much like the other modern Boeremusiek of the 1950s. So again, it's an act of imagination that is kind of conducted in sort of a negative discursivity by the people saying, oh, it's not that. Here you hear it, but it's not supposed to be that. So it's quite interesting, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering, how would you relate that to popularity of a song like Boerepompie, which is kind of like an ode to the concertina,
Yeah.
but within modern pop music. So would you see that as purely nostalgic, or do you think there is a place for the concertina in modern Afrikaans music?
Yeah, I've been quite interested in those performances. You don't really, because I think you don't really get that much Boeremusiek as such anymore. You get more of this kind of thing where you have a sort of a socky pop music with concertina references. I think if I have to take the argument of my own book to kind of analyze this, I think there's a huge space in the South African sort of imaginary for bad music, because it if one has to put it crudely, it kind of holds this space of blackface performance in modern times. That's what I would say. And often in these examples, you do get specific references to blackface performance, which is quite overt, actually. So you would get, I'm thinking of another, I can't remember its name entirely, but there's a sort of also a pop tune, and then there's a concertina band playing, but they are sort of playing in the background. They have these striped jackets on, for instance. Or what's the artist, the black artist who sings in Afrikaans? Reponses. So there's a few very interesting examples of songs where he takes really Boeremusiek standards, and it's quite difficult to watch and to talk about, because he would take a tune like which is called still Outa in die Langpad, and he would perform almost the role of that black person in the song, which is quite difficult to understand from both, from his own perspective and for watching it. So I think this space where this sort of low down space where Afrikaner whiteness kind of works itself out, which kind of it's allowed to exist because it's seen to be so banal and everyday and not particularly important or meaningful or impactful. I think it has a long history, and I definitely see a sort of a trajectory with some of the earlier stuff.
I just was thinking about the music of David Kramer. Where would you place that? It's sort of a mix of.
Yeah, David Kramer is an interesting character. My colleague Paula should really be here to talk more about his collaboration with Tali Peterson.
Yeah.
But I think it's also one of those what looks like an outlier in Afrikaans music history. So Nico Carstens would be another one, or Nathaniel perhaps today, where you get these celebrities or these public figures who seem to portray musically everything that the political ideology does not. And Nico Carstens was another example like that, where he was accordionist, became very rich, selling Boeremusiek records, always denied that he played Boeremusiek, but did so nevertheless. and was was this racially ambivalent figure. So people would have referred to the texture of his hair, suggesting that he wasn't white, that he wasn't making white music, and yet his records sold to white audiences. So again, if one takes the blackface idea, which was in the 19th century, this hugely popular form of white entertainment and black entertainment, but hugely popular among white audiences, and think of how it moves into the 20th century, it's not surprising at all that contemporary audiences would still find that in a more sanitized version, perhaps, would still find that entertaining. And I think it's a difficult area to negotiate because of course there's also a lot of positive things to say for these sort of cross-racial music making, especially during apartheid. There are many other examples of white artists who have done so and then to support, for instance, the anti-apartheid movement and things like that. But I think it is a hugely difficult thing to negotiate for artists. And one cannot deny, I think, looking at the history of popular music in South Africa, but also globally, that race is actually one of those things that drove the entertainment industry. And it's not because it's referenced in some kind of oblique way, but because the music itself plays on racial stereotypes and does so in order to elicit pleasure, and have done so. So it's a difficult matter, and I think, but I think perhaps David Kramer's music is better understood in the context of whiteness than in the context of coloredness.
In the examples you showed, it seemed to me that the Boeremusiek was in both cases, instrumental only, and the crowds in the church and somewhere else on the street were singing. Would you say that this is sort of a difference, a tendency that Boeremusiek is more or less focused on instruments? Or does singing also have a certain role in it, and the lyrics and the messages which are transported by the words?
No, definitely there's a lot of Boeremusiek that also have vocals. More so in the past than contemporary forms. So I would say up to perhaps the 1960s, 70s, it started to be less so. But if you look at those very early Boeremusiek recordings by David de Lange, they're all mostly vaudeville hits translated pretty directly into Afrikaans. So then you get lots of Boeremusiek with Afrikaans lyrics. Often you would only get it on that minor section theme where everyone sort of goes like this. So then the words would have been added to that section, and not like in a general pop tune where you would have a verses. So the words would be reserved for those. So the tune would be instrumental with a vocal interlude almost, not like verse style with chorus. But you get many interesting examples in the 1950s where you would get songs with words, and then you would get Boeremusiek instrumental dance versions of those songs. And I think those are really quite interesting because the words of those tunes are often quite problematic. I'm thinking here of something like Rickshaw Boy by performed by Nico Carstens and Aldebo, where the song is about describes the actions of a rickshaw puller in Durban. So and makes a kind of similes with different animals, crowing like like there's all kind of different animal metaphors going on. But then the most popular versions of those tunes would be instrumental versions. but I think at that time the words would have been so part of the popular consciousness, it was almost not even necessary to have the words anymore. So you get a lot of that, different versions, different or made for dancing. It was also a general movement, I think, in the 60s, 70s to produce dance records with covers, but without the words. So it's lots of schmaltzy, entertainment, dance music doing that thing. But Boeremusiek definitely did that too. Yeah.
So to say that it's rather focusing on dancing together in some cases than singing together.
Yes, definitely.
And psalms are sung in a crowd or something. That does not really appear in Boeremusiek a lot, does it?
Singing together.
Yeah.
No. So it is a matter of movement, but often you would have the concert dance model of an evening out. So what they would do is first they would have a concert, the same band, and they would play to an audience, a paying audience, and then after the concert is over, it would move into a dance, and it would be much more riot, much more wild, and would go on afterward, for a long time afterwards. So sometimes also a bit of both, and you would also get it as a sort of a theater, almost as a theater show. So you would have Boeremusiek numbers, but you would also sometimes have a concert where there would be different genres performed, or even and lots of humorous skits even with comedians, and then Boeremusiek. You see those kinds of things depicted in early Afrikaans movies sometimes, so you get a sense of how it might have worked. It's quite difficult to unpick exactly how it was done. But you seem to suggest that there's a difference between these two performances in the use of the voice. Yeah.
I had in mind.
Yeah, and can you elaborate a little bit more?
Not really, I would say, not spontaneously, no.
But it is I think what fascinates me about this, because it feels sort of intuitive that when people sing together, that that we assume, like when there's a choir or people singing together, that there's a sort of striving for solidarity in some sense. It's easier sort of to understand that. It's less so when one in I think in the little scholarship that's been done on Boeremusiek, that idea is sort of less prevalent. It would be more about how to preserve a folk tradition than how this music promotes a kind of a social identity of some kind. I think that's a sort of a fault line in music studies between studying music from different parts of the world.
Sorry, doesn't the groove basically imply a kind of solidarity?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so I'm saying that this is that how it used to be, but this is kind of exactly the point that I'm trying to make in the book, is that even though those one has to kind of look at the music a little bit sideways and listen to it in different ways and read the language that describes the music in a kind of a pragmatic way. I'm suggesting that just as people have written about the music of the Black Atlantic, there's a sort of an affective content that is intergenerationally transmitted through the trauma and history of slavery. There's a similar kind of thing going on in in music that has dealt with whiteness. So that there is a kind of a solidarity there, but those things are not often not heard as being social things, but as personal things. So when people are moved in a way, then it's seen as a personal affection, of a personal aesthetic sensibility, and not near, and that's how individualistic cultures work. Not really as a sort of a communal ways of appreciating and thinking and feeling.
there's no more questions, I will end the stream.
Thank you so much.
So much. Thank you. From the house. And I'll just get some wine so we can discuss a little like a little more in the Voorhuis.
Thank you, Wilson.
Nou, iets om over na te denken.
Sure.